Hey everybody, my name is Adam and I'm one of the pastors here at Boulder Creek Community Church Online. I want to thank you for taking time to tune in. Maybe someone who loves you sent you a link and you're not familiar with Boulder Creek Community Church. I pray and I hope that this message will meet you right where you're at, in a very difficult year, in a very difficult season. I've decided to do a 3-part series called Christ in the Movies. I heard this on the radio this week. Literally 82 movies, new Christmas movies, are coming out in the year 2020. 75 of them, I think, are going to be on the Hallmark Channel, and I can proudly say I have never seen one of those movies. But 82 movies. I don't know about you, because it's been a difficult year, and maybe because I'm getting older, I've been a little nostalgic. And so my son and I, my 13-year-old son and I, we've been binging Andy Griffith's show. Man, I had no memory of that show being as funny as it is. But maybe it's because I'm feeling nostalgic. I've decided to pick 3 movies that are classic movies, older movies. And I hope that they will encourage you and bless you, and that they will help you see that in these beautiful stories, that there is a more powerful story, the gospel story, that can radically change your life. Well, the first movie I've chosen is from an old book called A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol was written back in the mid-1800s, and many movies have been inspired by this book, from the 2009 Disney version to even the Muppet version, which I understand is very close to the book. I actually read the book this week and absolutely loved it. I'd never read the book before, and I highly encourage it. A Christmas Carol. It was written by Charles Dickens back in 1843, and it's certainly his most popular book. What's interesting is that this book became the catalyst for rekindling the joy and the meaning of Christmas in both America and in England during a time when the meaning of Christmas had all but been lost. Charles Dickens was inspired to write this story when he visited a manufacturer's plant in Manchester, and he witnessed the conditions of the workers and saw so many people who were struggling and so poor. As the story began to take shape and unfold in his mind, and as he began to pen the words for this book, he became absolutely engrossed in the experience. He wrote that as the tale unfolded, that he wept and laughed and wept again. As he walked about the black streets of London, 15 or 20 miles, many a night, in his words, when all sober folks had gone to bed. Most of you are familiar with The Christmas Carol. It's a story about a guy named Ebenezer Scrooge, who's a very greedy man, a very broken man, a very lost man. But he's visited by 3 ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. Well, I want to draw out just 2 very important lessons from A Christmas Story. And the first one is this. This story teaches us the power of greed. See, here's the thing about greed. You can't see it in the mirror. Nobody sees it in the mirror. And yet it's something that we all struggle with. Greed could be defined as the distorted longings, misplaced cravings that we all have. I find it interesting that we all tend to compare down when it comes to ethics or morals. We tend to compare down and think, well, I'm better than that person. But when it comes to greed, we tend to compare up. And we wrestle with this constant sense, if I just had a little bit more. And we compare ourselves that have better jobs, bigger houses, nicer cars, whatever it may be. But we all wrestle with greed at some level. We all have this distorted longing, this misplaced craving, this sense that if I just had a little bit more. The book of James puts it this way: when desire has been conceived, it gives birth to sin. Desire in and of itself is not bad. In fact, we are to have a deep desire for the things of God. But so often, because our desires are distorted by sin, we live with these misplaced cravings. Here's what's interesting about greed. These misplaced cravings or distorted desires, they are very, very powerful. More powerful than we realize. In fact, they're so powerful, they can override our reasoning, they can override our intellect, and they can even go against our instinct for survival. Take, for example, the distorted cravings for alcohol or drugs. And we know that these addictions can actually produce a biological craving that is killing us. But it's more than that. We also see this, or we need to see this also in areas like over-anxiety, being overly fearful about certain things. And let's be honest, most of us, if we just looked in our closets or a garage, why is it that we have so much stuff? Much more than we actually need. What is it that compels us to continue to try to get more? As Scrooge is visited by the first ghost, the ghost of Christmas past, we see some very interesting things and learn some very interesting things about Ebenezer Scrooge. As he sees himself as a child, as a boy, we learn that he's very lonely. We learn that he grew up in poverty. As we see him at a party with a young woman, we see that these seeds of greed begin to override his sense of self. They begin to override his perspective of what really matters. And out of fear of losing the security that money brought him, out of fear of going back to poverty, even marriage, and especially having kids, was not an option. See, Ebenezer Scrooge got so distorted that his soul began to die. To even take a day off on Christmas was seen as being lazy. To help an organization by giving a few pennies to help the poor was seen as promoting them to not work. See, that's what greed does. That's what sin does. It destroys our souls and it skews our perspective of reality and of what matters most. Later on in life, Scrooge would be visited by the ghost of Christmas future. And this is where Scrooge finds himself at a cemetery. This is where he sees a tombstone with his name on it. He sees that dash. You know what I'm talking about? That dash between the date of birth and the date of death. Years ago, when I was in youth ministry, I used to take seniors through a discipleship course. And at the very beginning, I would take them to a nearby cemetery, and I would give them 20 or 30 minutes just to walk around. No instructions, just to be quiet and read the tombstones. And as we gathered again, and I would listen to their experiences and what they thought of it, I would always remind them, look, that dash represents a life. And I know you're only 18 years old, but one day you'll be 6 feet under, and there'll be a group of family and friends, and they'll be eating potato salad, and they'll be talking about your dash. What is it that you want your dash to represent? What do you want to be remembered for? Well, Ebenezer Scrooge has this experience, and he pleads for a second chance. You know the story, he wakes up and he actually is given another chance. And he absolutely repents. That is, he changes. He goes from being a greedy miser to a happy, childlike, generous, give stuff away in unbelievable amounts. And that's my second point. A Christmas Carol not only teaches us about the power of greed, but it also teaches us about the power of grace. And that's what God wants to do with us. He wants to move us from greed to grace. And grace always leads to a life of giving, to a life of generosity. There's a character in the Bible that actually reminds me of Scrooge. Maybe you've heard the story, especially if you grew up in church, you might remember this story. It's about a wee little man. That's right, Zacchaeus. In Luke chapter 19, it says this: Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man there by the name of Zacchaeus, he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. And so he ran ahead and climbed, what kind of tree? That's right, a sycamore tree, just so that he could see him. And since Jesus was coming that way, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Now, this was very controversial. This was way out of bounds for a rabbi, for a holy man, to spend time with scum. Tax collectors were the low on the totem pole. They were traitors to their own people. They were greedy misers. They extorted from their very own people, and they had the backing of Roman soldiers to do it. And so while Jesus invites himself to this man's home, listen to the response. Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. But all the people who saw this began to mutter, "He is gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Do you see what's happening here? Jesus didn't tell him to do this. Jesus didn't guilt him or shame him. He didn't say, "Now, Zacchaeus, remember the rules." Zacchaeus had experienced the grace of God, and he could not help but become generous and give in radical ways, in irresponsible ways, in ways that maybe even hurt. And Jesus says this: "Today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." When someone experiences the grace of God, one of the evidences, one of the hallmarks of a life that has been touched by the grace of God is that person becomes radically generous. Now, I know some of you don't have a lot. Some of you have a lot. And this is not a question of being rich or poor. This is not a question of how much you have. It is a question of what are you doing with what you have? What are you doing with who you are? The first century Christians looked very odd and very strange to the people in the first century. And one of the big reasons is because they did radical things with their money. They did radical things with their land and their stuff. They gave away unreasonable amounts. And in a day and age when Christians were hated and intensely persecuted and thousands of them died, nevertheless, within one generation, Christianity exploded and spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire. Within one generation. And that happened in part because of the radical view that Christians had of their money and of their stuff and of their time. The way Luke put it in Acts chapter 4, as he observed these Christians who were giving away incredible amounts of money, bringing it to the apostles and laying it at their feet so that they could give it away to the poor and to the needy. He says this: "And they felt that what they owned was not their own." They felt that what they owned was not their own. Is that how you view your money? Is that how you view your stuff? History shows us over and over that when the church is focused not on what it can gather, but on what it could scatter, people take notice. See, everybody has a bottom line. Every business has a bottom line. If you work for a company, you know that bottom line. It is profit. Whether they sell microchips or burritos, the bottom line is profit. Every church has a bottom line as well, but it's not about what we gather. It's not about profit. Our bottom line is about what we can give away. How can we leverage who we are? How can we leverage what we have and be a blessing to others? See, Jesus didn't come to give us a second chance. We get a second chance, don't get me wrong. We get third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh chances. But don't misunderstand the gospel. Don't misunderstand a Christmas carol. It's not about giving us a second chance. See, Jesus didn't come to give us a second chance. He didn't come to be an example of how we're supposed to live our lives. He didn't come to say, do these things, don't do these things. Think about it just for a sec. If Jesus came merely to be an example for us, to show us how we're to live our lives, then he's an absolute failure. At least from my perspective, I could never live up to the standard Jesus has set. When he walks into the room, I become keenly aware of how short I fall. I can never be as good as him. I can never be as generous as him. So Jesus didn't come to give us a second chance. He came so that he can radically redeem our lives. Because you and I can't redeem our lives. But when we experience the grace of God, when our lives truly experience what Zacchaeus experienced, we can't help but become more giving and more generous with what we have. See, the real Christmas story tells us that Jesus came not to be an example for us, but Jesus came to eventually die on a cross, to be risen again for your sin and for my sin. He came to redeem us. He gave. And that's why we give gifts every Christmas, because it's a small example of a great God who gave his only begotten Son, that if we would just believe, that if we would put our trust and our hope in him, we would experience life, eternal life. And for some of us, it might mean that our lives get completely turned upside down. See, grace, when we experience it, it erodes our possessiveness. It erodes that thing within us that feels like we have to hold on to our stuff, that we have to get more. It erodes that possessiveness that we have of our money, of our stuff, and of our time. When the CZU fires hit us here in the San Lorenzo Valley, as soon as things opened up, I was blown away by the generosity of so many Christians and several churches who contacted me and said, we want to help. We quickly became a hub where people came to get sifters, to get water, to get bedding, to get clothing, and sometimes just to get a hug and to be prayed over. But it was Christians who, in unreasonable and radical ways, gave. I've always believed this, but the church is at its best in a crisis. See, it's in a crisis when we realize what is really most important. It's in a crisis when we realize it's not about what we gather, but what we scatter. It's not about what we get, but what we give. The board talked this last week about how generous so many people and so many churches have been to us. And we felt like we can't receive this generosity and not reciprocate in some way. And so we want to invite you to a couple of opportunities. We've narrowed it down to 2. And they're familiar with you if Boulder Creek Community Church is your home. If you go to our website, there'll be a tab at the top that says Easy Tithe. And on that page, there's another tab, a drop-down box, that gives you 3 options. You can give to our general fund, but you can also give to Operation Feed the People. Operation Feed the People, if you're not aware, is an organization every Wednesday where we give away sometimes a couple of hundred meals every week. No strings attached, no questions asked. Simply want to be a blessing to those in the community. And we thank Chef Eric for bringing this ministry to us and spearheading it and being the heart and soul behind it. Some of you, if you'd like to give a year-end gift above your regular giving, pray about Operation Feed the People. Some of you may also want to pray about CZU fire victims, as many people are still displaced, and as you know, some of you are still out of a home. And you're wondering when, and you're dealing with insurance and the headache and the turmoil of all of that. If you want to make a contribution year-end to go towards the CZU fire victims, then you can give on that tab. And for Operation Feed the People and CZU Fires, 100% of that, we don't take any part out of it, nobody benefits from it, other than the people that we identify who come to us with needs, and we're simply able to help them. And you know, I was thinking about this because we're a small church. And when you're a small church, you sometimes think small. You sometimes think that, well, we can't do much. But I want to remind you of a story about a little boy who didn't have much. He had a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread. But he gave them to Jesus. It was all he had. And Jesus took what he had and leveraged it and would then feed thousands of people. And so it's not a question of how much you have. God can take what you have and multiply it in unknown ways. And so I want to invite you. I want to challenge you. Wherever you're at, whenever you're at, even if you're struggling, lean into this. Don't become overly fearful. Don't become overly anxious. Don't isolate. Don't turn inward. Christmas is about thinking about others. And so lean into the grace of God. Walk in that grace. Live in that grace. And let that grace and the power of it radically shape you and change you into a generous person.